Welcome to Pleasureology Island. I'm Free Thought Steve. Thanks for stopping by. I've been talking about ethics, and I want to move on today specifically to focus on the issue of sexual ethics. And my basic argument today is going to be that the Bible-based purity culture harms our sexual development by stunting our sexual emotional growth and by creating emotional conflicts that eventually result in a permanent state of anxiety and tension in the body, which Wilhelm Reich called body armor, and also character armor or emotional armoring, and that this state of chronic organismic tension is something that, in order to experience full sexual pleasure and happiness, we need to undo that state of chronic organismic tension. And we undo it by relaxation, and we undo it not just by mental relaxation or emotional relaxation, but also by physical relaxation of our body, and by relaxing the autonomic nervous system inside our body, which is part of emotional relaxation. So I call this body-mind relaxation, and it's what I myself used to dissolve my own chronic organismic tension and learn how to relax, and eventually learn how to experience super euphoric sex, high arousal sexual bliss for long periods of time with good ejaculatory control, and relaxation is the key to ejaculatory control, and then being able to trigger orgasm basically at will by summoning up a especially sexy thought or something like that that takes us up over the orgasm threshold and triggers the orgasm reflex, and having what I call cosmic orgasms, full consciousness orgasms. This is all made possible only after we have undone the chronic organismic tension that was built into our bodies by being brought up in a Christian atmosphere, and particularly in a Christian sexual purity culture where we were taught that our sexual feelings were sinful and bad. And so body-mind relaxation is the therapy that I used to cure myself, and I want to share it with you and offer it to you so that if you want to use it to help improve your own body-mind relaxation state, then you'll be able to do that. So that's my ultimate goal here. Now, getting back to ethics, because we want to have a clear conscience about the sexual activity that we engage in. We want to feel like we're not doing anything wrong at all, that we're doing something good and innocent and positive. Pleasure, pain, and intelligence, or foresight, are our guides to what is good for us and to what to avoid. Pleasure tells us when we're doing something that's good for us. Our emotional brain has evolved to reward us with feelings of pleasure and euphoria when we're doing something that is good for ourselves, which includes passing on our genes to another generation. So that's good for the whole species. Natural selection would not have passed on our genes if we couldn't pass them on to another generation. So our genes would have dropped out of the human gene pool. But we all have a strong sex drive because that's the way that one generation passes on its genetic information to another generation and creates another generation of human beings. And sexual pleasure, coming with orgasm, is one of the ways that our brain tells us we're doing something good for ourselves and for our species. Now, it's not necessarily a good thing for us to actually create a lot more human beings on the planet. We should be creating only one or two human beings in addition to ourselves in our lifetime. But we have a sex drive that goes on and on throughout our entire lifetime and is constantly active, because at a certain point in human evolutionary history, the population was very small And it was important for us to, if we wanted to survive as a species, to have as many offspring as possible. So we developed this continuous sex drive, which we still have, even though that sex drive has become so successful in populating the earth with human beings that we're in danger of overpopulating it. So now we need to take that sex drive and stop using it to overpopulate the planet. But nevertheless, it's something that, it's a drive that we have. The urge for sexual pleasure is built into us and continues throughout our lifetime. And it doesn't go away after we've had one child or two children or three children at the most. Our sex drive keeps operating because that's the way our brain is built. So what we need to do is find a way of satisfying that sex drive, that urge for sexual pleasure, satisfying it on a daily basis or as often as we want to, several times a day or, a couple times a week or whatever is comfortable for you, whatever keeps your particular sex drive at a reasonable level. We need to be able to satisfy our sex drive without creating more babies, without creating more children. And so solo sex is the best way to do that. But we can also do it with partner sex as long as we use contraception. So that's where it's not just pleasure that should guide us, but also our intelligence, because our intelligence can go beyond the present moment. Our emotional desire for pleasure is pretty much limited to the immediate situation, but we can use our intelligence and our ability to visualize the future consequences of our actions in order to use contraception so that we can enjoy partner sex as much as we want without creating more children, which are an economic burden to us and which will eventually overpopulate the whole planet. So our guides to action are three: pleasure and pain, or pleasure and distress, which tells us what to avoid in the immediate situation, and our intelligence, which tells us what kinds of pleasures and pains we could expect in the future as a result of the decision we're making right now to enjoy this sexual pleasure right now, or to forego this sexual pleasure right now until we can make it safe so that we don't have any negative consequences in the future. So intelligence has to work together with pleasure, which tells us when we're doing something good, and pain or distress, which tells us when we're doing something that might be injuring ourselves, and we should avoid that kind of stuff. So pleasure and pain should guide us along with our intelligence. And I was talking last time about the ethics of autonomy as opposed to the ethics of authority. Authority is when other people tell us what to do and we just follow what they say, we obey what they say, and as long as we obey what they tell us to do, then they consider us good persons and we consider ourselves good persons. But autonomy, the ethics of autonomy means self-governance. We choose for ourselves. We make our own decisions for ourselves, what we think is right and wrong, what we think is good and bad to do. And then we get the responsibility, we have the responsibility for making wise, intelligent choices because we're looking at each situation as it comes up. And each situation is unique. And so we have to do what's called situation ethics, meaning in each situation, we're always trying to do the same thing in general. We're trying to increase the euphoria in the consciousness of whoever's involved in the situation, increase the happiness and good feelings in our consciousness, and avoid creating distress. So that's always our overall goal. But in each situation, it may be, since that situation is unique, that a different decision, a different choice would be made. In this situation, the most rational and euphoria-producing choice may be to have wonderful partner sex with someone that we're affectionate with and that we love, and we're sure that we have good sexual hygiene and we're using contraception. That may be in one situation. Yes, the decision is let's enjoy sex. In another situation where there's no contraception available, and even though I want to have sex with this person, and even though I love this person very much, and there would be nothing morally wrong with me having sex with this partner. Nevertheless, if we don't have any contraception available and we don't want to have a child, which would force us to have to deal with raising that child in the future, if we want to avoid that, then we will avoid sexual intercourse in that situation until we can get a hold of some contraception and use it effectively so that we don't have those negative consequences in the future. So our intelligence helps us decide in every given situation what to do. It's not just what we want to do, but also does our intelligence tell us that if we do what we want to do, there will be no negative consequences in the future. And so autonomous ethics where we make up our own mind and make our own decisions and choices, involves the responsibility of being intelligent and realistic about the specific situation that we're in and finding out what's the most rational thing to do in the sense of what will create happiness without creating any delayed unhappiness. In order to, however, decide that we're going to be autonomous, self-governing, ethical agents, we're going to choose for ourselves what's right and wrong, this involves oftentimes having to leave behind the values of our birth community. Our birth community has imposed certain types of values, and particularly sexual values upon us, particularly religious sexual values. And to be an autonomous ethical agent, we may have to reject those values, those traditional values of our birth community or the family that we grew up in. And so we may say, I choose not to let the Bible dictate to me how I'm going to live my sex life, because the Bible is the great big book of collected Israelite mythology and Greco-Roman mythology from 2,000, 3,000 years ago. And I choose not to let a book of mythology, which means guesses about the unknowable God, guesses about the unknowable God that were made thousands of years ago, I choose not to let that book dictate to me what my sexual choices are going to be in the 21st century, when we now do have contraception available, and when we understand medically what we have to do in order to have safe sex, hygienic sex. And there's no necessity for us to get married to everyone we have sex with if we're careful to use contraception and not have children with them. We can make our own decisions about this, and if we choose to have sex with someone of our own gender, of our own sex, because that's what turns on our emotional brain, then that's our decision to make, not the decision of people who died thousands of years ago. We choose not to let people who died thousands of years ago dictate to us how we're going to live our lives in the 21st century. In the process of moving away from our birth community and the values that are moving away from our birth community and the traditional values that our birth community has imposed upon us, breaking free from that, requires a lot of emotional strength. And it's good if we can get emotional support from other people who have the same kind of attitude toward traditional values, saying, I'm sorry, I'm not going to let traditional values that have been handed down through centuries and centuries and many, many generations, I'm not going to let those traditional values govern my life, because I'm living now, here and now, in a world that's entirely different from the kind of world that those people imagined they were living in 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. Now we understand how vast the universe is. We understand that natural laws are what are causing all the weather phenomena and all the other phenomena of life. We live in a scientific world, and we should use the scientific information that we have to help us make choices that make us happy in our lives here and now. We shouldn't have to conform to the pattern of life that was dictated by people living thousands of years ago. Those are outmoded. They're no longer rational because they're not up to date as far as creating happiness rather than unhappiness. But we shouldn't indulge in groupthink, whether it's the groupthink of the traditional community that we came from and we are leaving behind. We should reject their groupthink, their religious groupthink. But at the same time, we shouldn't just automatically and uncritically adopt values of a new counterculture without thinking them through for ourselves. The counterculture can have groupthink too, and when the individual feels like they have to conform to the thoughts and beliefs of the whole group, that's groupthink. And we don't want that in the counterculture. We want to learn from each other, we want to share ideas with each other, and we want to be as intelligent as we can. And when our ideas agree with each other, that's great. But we always want to keep our individuality and our own ability to judge any ideas that other people suggest to us, including all the ideas I suggest to you. I want you to have a critical attitude toward the ideas, because my ideas are generated by my brain, which is non-artificial intelligence. And as you may know, non-artificial intelligence, just like artificial intelligence, is liable to contain errors. Artificial intelligence contains errors, so does non-artificial intelligence. So, that's all I'm offering you is some non-artificial intelligence that contains errors, but I don't know what they are, because if I did know what the errors were, I wouldn't say them. But I know there must be mistakes here. Now, talking about sexual ethics versus Bible-based purity culture. A first principle is, if we are going to be realistic, autonomous ethics practicers, if we're going to practice realistic ethics and we're going to be autonomous ethical agents making our own decisions for ourselves, the standards that we use for judging whether activities are good or bad is going to be the same for all kinds of activities, including sexual activities. All kinds of activities we're going to consider to be good if they contribute to the happiness of all the participants who are involved in the situation, both now and in the future. Happiness, good. Unhappiness, bad. Okay? And that standard, that's what I call a rational standard, a reasonable standard. That's what intelligent people will choose. And we use our intelligence to foster our happiness. That's rational. This same standard of rational judgment should apply to sexual activities in exactly the same way that it applies to any other activities. Religious people tend to treat sex as something in a category all by itself. Sex is holy, sex is sacred, sex is something God gave us to use only in marriage, and we can only use sex if God blesses us. All right, that's the religious attitude, and God will only bless us if we're in a lifelong monogamous union. That's the Bible-based magical thinking behind the purity culture attitude towards sex. Their attitude that we should not have sex at all except, when we're married, and when God has blessed us and permitted us to have sex, that is a magical concept which is based on a whole lot of imaginary suppositions. A, that there is a God. Nobody knows anything about God, whether God exists or not. God is a human concept that we've projected out onto the universe, and since God is supposed to be non-physical, there's no way that we can scientifically prove whether God exists or not. So everybody's just guessing. And so there's no reason to assume that a God exists, that a God created us. As far as we know, our life on this planet evolved according to natural, physical, and chemical laws. It evolved on this planet about 1 billion years ago, but about 600 million years ago, life really got started, and organisms were reproducing by sex at least 600 million years ago, and probably longer ago than that. And all organisms reproduce by sex. It's just the way organisms reproduce. Reproduction is a biological process. It has nothing to do with any supernatural invisible beings. And our sexuality is built into us. It was given to us by our genes. It was not given to us by God. It was given to us by our biological genes, which created a brain containing an emotional brain. Here's the emotional brain in the middle of the brain. This is the outside of the brain. Here's the emotional brain. And our genes created this emotional brain, and that's where our sex drive comes from. Sexuality comes from our brain, our emotional brain. That's where our sexual desire comes from. The ability to have children comes from our sex organs, from our testes, our ovaries, our penis, our vagina, and clitoris. All of those things, and uterus. All of those things are what give us the capacity to reproduce. And all animals have that capacity. It's a biological part of being alive. And there's no reason to think that it's any different than any other kind of activity that we do, except that it can result in the creation of a new organism. That's the natural result of sexuality. And being intelligent, we recognize that that's the result of sexuality if we don't use contraception. So if we are simply having sex in order to satisfy our sex drive, or in order to form a deeper emotional bond with somebody that we care about and to enjoy the pleasure of partner sex. Either way, if we're having sex for the enjoyment of sex, for the pleasure of sex, and in order to satisfy our natural biological sex drive that we all have and that we can't help but have, if we're using sex to satisfy our sex drive, then it's simply something that we should do intelligently so that we can give ourselves that pleasure, enjoy the pleasure that our sexual pleasure system is capable of generating, but do so in a rational manner, in a sensible manner, so that we have euphoria. Both we and our partners have euphoria while we're having sex, and afterwards we feel really good, and we're sexually healthy, so we don't pass on any sexual bacteria or viruses to each other, and we're using contraception so that we don't create life accidentally. We should create life intentionally, only when we choose to do so. So when we do that, our sexuality belongs to us, and we can choose to satisfy our sex drive in any way that we think is ethically and intelligently a good way to do it. Solo sex, masturbation, is the easiest and safest way to satisfy our sex drive. So masturbation is ethically probably number one on the top of the list of ethical ways to satisfy our sex drive. And satisfying our sex drive is not a selfish thing. Satisfying our sex drive makes us happier persons as long as don't feel guilty about it. If we can really truly satisfy our sex drive, that makes us a more relaxed person because we're satisfying a natural drive that will keep making us restless and cranky if we don't satisfy it. If we do satisfy it, we're going to be more relaxed, we're going to be happier, we're going to enjoy life more, and so we're going to treat other people more nicely when we interact with them because we ourselves already feel good. This is known as the feel good, do good principle. When we feel good, we are nicer to other people. And we feel better when we're able to satisfy our sex drive with a lot of pleasure and without any guilt about it. Then we feel happier and more relaxed. We're nicer to other people. So making ourselves feel good by solo sex is a very pro-social thing. It's good for everyone around us because then we treat them nicer because we're sexually satisfied rather than sexually frustrated. So solo sex should be right at the top of ethically positive ways to satisfy our sex drive and give ourselves lots of euphoric pleasure. And euphoric states of consciousness are the only things in the universe that have intrinsic positive value. Only euphoric consciousness is something that is good as an end in itself. Everything else we do is only good as a means to producing euphoric states of consciousness in our consciousness and in the consciousness of other people. So partner sex is also a really good thing to do because we're creating euphoria not just for ourselves, but for our partner as well, if we're good at sex. And becoming good at sex is an ethically positive thing to do because it's one of the most wonderful ways to create euphoria both for ourselves and our partners, and equally important or more important, being able to have good sex with our partners fosters a better relationship with our partner. We get along better, our partner will love us more. If we're in a relationship where our partner does not satisfy us sexually, and yet we've decided to be in an exclusive relationship with that person because that's the only safe way these days to have sex is basically in a monogamous relationship, or to engage in sexual activities which have no risk of transmitting viruses or bacteria. So there's lots of ways to have sexual fun without the risk of sex. But in a partnership relationship where you want to have full-on sexual intercourse, it's best to be monogamous so that you don't take the risk of contracting an STD out here and then passing it to your partner. So anyway, partner sex is ethically good, not just for the sexual pleasure that we experience during sex, but because it strengthens our relationship. And if we have had children and we're wanting to raise those children and we want to stay in that relationship with our partner while we raise the children, then having a good sex life contributes to that a lot. And so the better we can be at our sexual activities, then the stronger our relationship will be. So that's a positive ethical thing too, is just what I was talking about, becoming sexually competent and learning to have a good sexual arousal process and a good orgasm process. Now, this doesn't happen just all by itself, and it requires a learning process. It requires a learning process for us to develop a fully strong and healthy sexual response process. And purity culture interferes with us doing the sexual learning that we need to do in order to develop a healthy sexual response process, including recognizing a sexy situation, allowing ourselves to become emotionally turned on by that sexy situation, beginning sexual activity, and thereby getting more pleasure, physical pleasure, from our sex organs and our bodies. And that adds to our pleasure. It builds up, and we go into high arousal in our consciousness. And when the high arousal bliss becomes so intense that our brain just can't handle it anymore, it triggers the orgasm reflex, and we have an orgasm. And we try and just relax into that orgasm, enjoy the orgasm as much as possible, and afterwards feel as content and calm as possible. And being able to do all of this without guilt or tension or anger or anything else, but just the enjoyment of being sexually turned on with our partner and interacting with our partner, or doing it by ourselves. Because the best way to learn the natural sexual arousal process is by ourselves, because we won't have any performance pressure. There won't be somebody sitting next to us saying, come on, get turned on. I'm waiting. I'm already turned on. Why aren't you? Come on. I'm ready to have an orgasm. Why aren't you? Blah, blah. Okay. Good sex is a learning process, and a partner situation is not the place to begin learning to enjoy sex unless you've got a partner who's already very experienced and very patient, and who doesn't expect you to perform extremely well the first time that you have sex, but is willing to take you through a learning process and help you become better and better at enjoying sex. And in order to go through the whole learning process of developing a healthy sexual response, it takes a lot of sexual experience to do that. And for most of us, the best way to start getting that sexual experience is to give it to ourselves in a solo sex situation where there's nobody putting any pressure on us, and we can just concentrate on recognizing a sexy situation. Our emotional brain recognizes this is a sexy situation. Our emotional brain turns on the sexual arousal circuits. The sexual arousal circuits are the output. The sexy situation is the input to the emotional brain. The emotional brain processes that input and puts sexual arousal energy as the output. And that makes us feel sexually turned on in our consciousness, and it causes physiological arousal in our sex organs, and we feel sexually turned on, and we get physically sexually turned on. And then we continue with the process of sexual activity and orgasm. Purity culture really tries to stop this whole process right in the beginning. Purity culture tells us that if we look at another person and feel sexual desire for them, that we've already committed sexual sin with them. It's just as though we've already had sex with them. Just because we look at them, we find them sexy, and we imagine having sex with them, that's just as bad as if we actually had sex with them. All right? This is total crazy thinking, and this is crazy making. To teach people that just makes us crazy. That's totally nuts. To not make any distinction between what goes on in our minds and our own consciousness and what we're actually doing with our bodies. All right? To imagine having sex with someone involves only us. To imagine having sex with someone and to masturbate thinking about that and give ourselves an orgasm, that involves no one but us. it involves our own consciousness, giving ourselves a euphoric state of consciousness and satisfying our own sex drive without inconveniencing or seriously annoying anyone around us, and without having any negative after effects. No STDs, no unwanted pregnancies, and not breaking anybody's heart, not cheating on anybody. We're just having sex ourselves and learning to enjoy our sexual pleasure system. The sexual pleasure system consists of the emotional brain, which has sexual circuits for recognizing a sexy situation, and then for creating sexual arousal, outputting sexual energy to the consciousness and to the body. And then the sexual pleasure system contains circuits for increasing the amount of pleasure that we get. Somehow there are some circuits that combine the physical sensations from our sex organs with the amount of emotional arousal that we're feeling, how turned on we are by the situation and by our partner, or by the imagined partner and the imagined situation. We get emotionally turned on. And there are certain circuits in our emotional brain that combine the physical pleasure that we're getting from our sex organs and the rest of our body, combine that physical pleasure with the emotional arousal excitement, or the amount of turn-on, the emotional turn-on that we're feeling. And they combine to create sexual bliss in consciousness, to create higher and higher amounts of sexual bliss in consciousness. And it's those high amounts of sexual bliss in consciousness formed by the combination of physical pleasure and emotional arousal that creates so much bliss in consciousness that they trigger the orgasm reflex. And there are other circuits in the emotional brain which are responsible for triggering the orgasm reflex and for then causing the contractions in the sexual organs, which produce ejaculation in the male and produce vaginal contractions in the female. And those contractions, those muscle contractions from the sex organs, then come up into the brain, and they combine with the other sexual pleasure and emotional arousal sensations in consciousness and give us this wave of orgasmic pleasure, one wave of pleasure after another, until the contractions in the muscles in the sex organs finally stop, and those waves of pleasure stop at the same time. But that leaves us with a great feeling of sexual satisfaction if it has been a nice, strong orgasm, and if we don't feel any guilt afterwards. So, in order to become sexually healthy, we have to undo our guilt feelings that we've learned from religion, and we also have to relax enough that we can enjoy high-powered orgasms, because orgasms are more powerful when we are relaxed enough to allow large amounts of sexual pleasure to accumulate in consciousness before we trigger the orgasm reflex. But that's the advanced form of sexuality that is super euphoric sex. Now, I'll talk next time about this process of sexual development and the learning process that we go through as we learn how to use our sexual pleasure system, and the difference between a culture that is sex positive and the kind of sexual education that young people got in, for instance, traditional Polynesia, or in the Trobriand's Islands, or in India in the Muria people, where the sexuality of young people, instead of being suppressed, was in fact enhanced and given the opportunity to develop in a natural way. And in a very sex positive way, a very satisfying way. And you'll see how different a sex positive way of letting youngsters grow up sexually, how different that is from the kind of sexual upbringing that we've all gotten in Christian culture, and particularly in the purity culture. Okay, thanks for listening. I'll talk to you again next time.